Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and I love going over old iconic games from some of the world's greatest chess players. And this game comes from the 1934 Zurich tournament. Now, every year there's going to be important tournaments that chess players care about. In the 1930s, the Zurich tournament was one of the largest and most important tournaments that they could play in. It had all the top chess players, and it was an international tournament, which they didn't have as many international tournaments as they do these days. And this is the most iconic game from that tournament. Our two players, White's going to be played by Max Euwe. At this point, he is 33 years old. This is right before he became the world champion. So he's one of the younger players in the tournament, but also doesn't have the notoriety that his opponent has. He doesn't have a world championship yet. His opponent, he's been a world champion for 27 years. That's Emanuel Lasker. At this point, he's 65. So he's towards the end of his both professional career as well as his life. But he is no stranger to the highest level of chess play. And he wants to make sure that this new kid on the block, who has been doing extremely well, Max Euwe, knows that he is still one of the greatest chess players of all time, although he is no longer the world champion. So we'll go ahead and get into it with Max starting out, and he plays d4, and then d5. We get into the Queen's Gambit line with c4, and then the Queen's Gambit declined with e6, just the normal main line here. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop here to g5, and then after knight to d7. This is the Cambridge Springs defense. And then we have e3. Now, common from here would be c6, knight f3, and then queen to a5. But Emanuel Lasker decides to change things up a little bit and play bishop to e7 instead. Max continues with queen to c2, and then castle on the king side and a3. Now, you don't always see the pawn coming up here to a3. If you are going to play your pawn up on the wings here, h3 is pretty common, but that's usually to stop the bishop coming down here to g5. That is not going to be happening anytime soon with this setup from Lasker here. But instead, you may see pawn take on d5. You could see bishop here to d3. This is threatening this pawn here on h7, especially right after black castles on the king side. You could always take here on f6. Then you're threatening here on h7. So White has lots of different options. He decides to opt for a3. A little slower move, but it does protect this square here on b4 from the bishop coming down, but usually not something that Black's even looking to do. He just played his bishop here to e7. If it comes down here, it's not even that bad if White recaptures with his pawn here on c3 if there is an exchange, because he can always just capture here on d5. There's no longer going to be double pawns here. So a3, not the move that I was expecting to see here from Max, but that's what he plays. And then rook to e8, centralizing his rook. Rook over here to c1 says, yeah, I'm expecting an exchange here at some point. Max may even be looking to take here on d5 himself here. This does put the rook on c1 for a semi-open file. And that's exactly what Lasker does. He takes with his pawn here, and then bishop recaptures here on c4, which is always what you want. You want to recapture material as well as develop. So this is a very active square for his bishop. Can also castle on the king side if he ever needs to bring his bishop back here to a2, one of Bobby Fischer's favorite squares for his light square bishop. He can do that as well. Knight to d5, great little outpost here. He can always recapture with his pawns on different options depending on how he wants to move forward in the game. But first, Max is going to take material here on e7, take that bishop. There's going to be an exchange, a knight here to e4. Knight comes back to f6. I thought from here when I was analyzing the game that you would just see the knight take here. After the knight takes, you see castle on the king side. Seems like a pretty good setup here. Instead, we see the knight come back here to g3. So not being super aggressive is Max against Lasker here. Then we see pawn c5. We do see castle on the king side. Pawn takes, knight recaptures here. And then knight to b6, attacking the bishop. Now, once he attacks it does come back here to a2. Always like the bishop coming back here to a2. Just such an annoyance for Black to have to deal with. It controls so much of the center of the board. Luckily for Black, he does have the pawn here on a6, or e6. So it does make it a little bit easier for him to not have to worry about the bishop eyeing down this long diagonal attacking the king, but still kind of annoying to have to worry about this bishop here on a2. Now, if you look from Black's perspective, he really needs to get his light square bishop involved into the game. Now, his rook and queen are playing somewhat defensive right now, and that's fine. He can always counterattack later. But for sure, bishop to d7 makes a lot of sense here. But instead, we see rook to b8, which this does set up for the bishop to get involved into the game. This bishop is defending the pawn, but the queen is also defending the pawn. So yes, he's bringing it over here so his light square bishop can move, and he doesn't have to worry about the light square bishop defending this. But knowing that the queen is here, I think he could have just played bishop here to d7. But he was the world champion for 27 years. He can kind of do whatever he wants to. He decides to play rook to b8, so we'll go with that. Pawn to e4, just trying to push in the center of the board here. Rook to d8, just going to get more involved into the center of the board. Came to e8 early on, didn't have any other options. Now that the board state has developed a little bit more, decides he wants to get a very active rook here and play rook to d8. Rook to d1. Just says, yeah, if you want to try to attack that, I want to defend that. A bishop to d7, so now does get the light square bishop involved into the game. Pawn to e5, forcing the knight to move. Comes back here to e8. So this is one of those times where you look at the board state and say, if one side's going to retreat, the other side should be pretty aggressive with their game plan. Bishop to b1, although it is coming back on one square, it is also attacking the square here on h7. So we do see g6, kind of the obvious move here, blocking the attack here coming from white standpoint. Queen to e4, always looking to centralize material. You want your most important pieces to attack as many squares as possible. That's exactly what queen to e4 does. Does attack the material here on b7. Since he played his bishop here to d7, he does have his rook here on b8 defending that, which is kind of what he was looking for early on. Bishop comes down here to a4. He does have his queen here on e7 now defending that as well, as we talked about. This is attacking the rook here. Decides, yeah, just go ahead and play pawn to b3, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back here to d7. Pawn a4, so really just almost baiting Max a little bit to push up his pawns a little bit. Decides now to bring his knight down to d5. This is another outpost here with the pawn. Probably not going to be exchanging material here with his queen or his rook, and don't really see a very easy path for his bishop to get here as well. So this knight here on d5 is pretty much going to be staying there for a while. Bishop to d3, just centralizing a little bit more. Since the pawn came to g6, there's not going to be attacking on the king side. So wants to get the bishop involved into the game. Rook to c8, bishop to c4. So definitely maneuvering a lot, trying to get rid of the knight here on d5. Bishop to c6 says, yeah, if you want to exchange, that's fine. We'll go ahead and do that. Takes the knight here, or takes with his knight here on c6. We do see an exchange, so we have an isolated pawn here for black on the c file, something he's going to have to worry about defending for the rest of the game unless he exchanges that off the board. Rook here to d3, knight down here to b4, attacking the rook. Rook swings over here to f3. So both sides, if you kind of think about their strategies here, Max is really looking to now attack on the king side of the board. He's always had his knight over here to g3, which early on we thought he may take material here on f6, exchange knights. He brought it back here to g3 and has not done anything with that. It's now time to start getting involved into the attack here. Swinging his rook over here, he can now bring his other rook involved into the game. He can play h4, start to chip away on the king side of the board. If you look from Lasker's standpoint, he now has two rooks that are involved into the game. White has given up control of the d file, so he can get his d file, the rook, involved into the game. And now he can start to counterattack with his own queen. Does need to get his knight involved into the game. It's not doing anything right here on the e8 square. So that's really what both sides are going to be looking to do going forward. Lasker plays rook to c7, preparing to bring his rook over here to d7. Double up his rooks and really control this d file. Pawn to h4, as we talked about. Rook to d7, and then h5 right here, starting to chip away on the king side of the board. Queen down here to g5 says, yeah, okay, you got a lot of material over here. I got to get my queen involved, try to stop some sort of crazy attack that you're going to have here. Rook here to e1, and then rook down to d4, attacking the queen on e4. Now, Max looks at this and says, I'm not even worried about you taking my queen right here. I'm going to go ahead and take your pawn on g6. Now, usually if you're playing a top-level player, they're not just going to give up their queen for no reason. And so that's the reason that you see the pawn take back here on g6, because this is definitely a trap. If you take with your rook here on e4, then Max is just going to take with his pawn on f7. This is check. After the king moves, then knight takes here on e4. This is threatening the queen. The queen pretty much has to move here. After the queen moves, then the pawn can take here on e8. This could pretty much be any piece. This could be a queen attacking the king here. Could be a knight attacking the queen. I went ahead and said, yeah, it could be a knight. But after the king takes, then the bishop takes here on e6. Yes, white no longer has a queen, but he has a lot of material on the board. This king right here on e8 is completely exposed. White should have a much better game going into the end game here. So that's why, while yes, he could take the queen here on e4, decides correctly, yeah, we're not going to be doing that because white can overwhelm me. Take back with my pawn here, and there's still a lot of protection in front of his king. How can white really attack this right now? He can't. He's going to have to chip away a little bit more. So after that's defended correctly, now white does need to bring his queen back here to e2. Rook down to d2. Always want to get your rooks down to the second rank if you're black. Just putting so much pressure on your opponents. Queen comes back here to f1, and this is one of those situations where you can feel it's shifting towards Emanuel Lasker's standpoint. You never want to have your queen down here to f1. This is sort of, I'm playing just completely defense. Could have easily just gone to queen e3 and says, yeah, you're putting a lot of pressure. We can exchange on the board. The queen comes off. That's completely fine. Yes, you have double pawns here on the e-file, but white's completely in a situation where they can at least draw. May not win in this position, but once you bring your queen back here to f1, now you just have to hope for a draw because you're in complete defense mode. Lasker continues the attack with knight to c2, and Max, it almost looks like he found an out here, and he plays knight to e4, one of the more iconic forks that you see in chess, looking to attack both the rook here and the queen, but Lasker saw that. He wasn't threatened by that at all after he played knight to c2, because knight coming to e4, he just is going to continue with his own game plan, and that is queen to e5. Now, this does give up his queen, but this is completely fine, all part of his strategy. The reason he gives up his queen is knight to f6, and this is what was played in the game. This is a check and a discovered attack on the queen. So pretty much Lasker needs to take with his queen. Queen takes here, takes the knight. Rook comes up here to f6, and the knight takes that rook right here. So he did get a pawn. He got that pawn here on e5. Got a knight and a rook. And for him, that was enough material, knowing that he has so much material attacking his opponent. And his opponent, Max, doesn't have a lot of material involved into the game. And so all that put together still has an attack on this rook right here on e1. So that was a good enough exchange for me to give up my queen. Rook comes here to c1. And then the knight starts to get involved into the game. And Emanuel Lasker, if you look at a lot of his games, does so well with two knights. It's just really fun to watch how he maneuvers all over the board and just controls so much of the board, especially in the end game, and that's exactly what he does here. Bishop comes down here to e2, just trying to defend as much as possible here. Knight to d4, attacking the bishop. Bishop here to f3. Knight comes down, takes on f2. Nothing really that white can do here. Can't take with his king, obviously. It's defended by the rook. Can't take with his queen. It would fall to the rook. Queen comes up here to c4. Continues the attack. Knight to d3, attacking the rook. Rook comes over here to f1, playing defense. Knight to e5. This is now forking both the queen and the bishop here on f3. Queen comes over here. Says, yeah, I'll go ahead and exchange material here. After the pawn takes, knight down here to e2, attacking the king. But you can see it's now opening up for more attacking lines for black. The king is completely exposed here. Both the rook and the knight are doing extremely well attacking together. And the rook can also come down, start to attack. We haven't even mentioned all the pawns he could start pushing if he wanted to as well. King comes to h2. Knight up here to f4. This is a discovered attack. Now the rook is attacking the king. Then we see the king come down here to h1. Rook to d4, attacking the queen. Queen comes up here to e7. Where else does the queen really go? Yes, I don't like the move from the queen coming up here to e7. It's completely alone. That's not what this game is about anymore. Why are you bringing material up here? But really, there's no good squares for white to come to. Lasker then comes to g7, just stopping some of the squares that the queen could come to that might be annoying to him. Queen back here to c7, attacking the knight, but the knight's completely defended. Both of the rooks are defended. The king over here on h1, not defended at all. You can start to see how this is not going to go well for white. Rook comes down here to d5. This also opens up the door for the rook to come over here to h5. Then we have rook e1. Rook here to g5. Could have also just played his rook over here to h5 as well. Check. In this case, maybe queen or king to g1. Pawn down here e5. Maybe the rook captures. The rook comes down here to d1. We could see the knight get involved into the action. Doesn't really matter how it goes. It's going to end extremely well for Lasker. Just so much material attacking the king here. He can eventually just bring his rook over here to e1. He has both the knight and the rook attacking this rook here on e5. So a lot of different options in the game. Decided that he was just going to build up a little bit more, and instead of bringing his rook to h5, bring it to g5. Just stopping all the squares that white can go to. Can't bring it to the g file now, and is also attacking the square here on g2 with his knight. So now all he has to do is attack on the h file, and it should be good game. Queen takes on c6. No other good options. If you start to look at where white can go here, his queen and his rook not connected at all, so they're kind of on their own just trying to attack. That's not going to help. And then rook to d8, and this is where Max decided to go ahead and give up because rook coming over here to h8 is inevitable. There's no way to really stop it. Yes, Max could come in and try to save face by playing queen to c3, checking the opponent. It's just going to delay the inevitable. He's going to end up losing the queen. Even if he brought his queen down here to c2 just to block it over here on h2, just going to delay the inevitable. So this is one of those games where 20 moves ago, we may have had someone nowadays, they would just resign because they went down a little bit and they'd move on. That's why I really like some of these older iconic games, especially with some of the top level players. They appreciated the art form that was the end game. They let their opponent do their thing. And so we see something like this go to the 50th move, and they played it out. Until now, it's pretty much over now. But we're back in the day. We just would not have ever seen a game like this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Emanuel Lasker, don't get to see too many of his games. Definitely plan on covering more of them. But yeah, 27 years as the world champion, even at 65 years old in this tournament, showing he still has a thing or two left in his tank against Max, 33 years old. You know, no one even knows that he's going to be the world champion pretty soon here. But I think he got a little taste of what it takes to be at the highest level. This probably propelled him in the near future to become the world champion. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. If there are other iconic games that you want me to cover, feel free to let me know. Or if there's any other chess openings, strategies, anything like that, let me know. Best way to get a hold of me is through email, the chess website at gmail.com. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.